My own daughter left me to die in a foreign country, laughing as she drove away with her husband. But what happened 1 week later changed everything, and I mean everything. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you love most, you'll understand the fire that burned in my chest that day. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because this story, it could happen to anyone anywhere. You know, when people ask me about forgiveness, I tell them there are some things that cut so deep, they change the very fabric of who you are. I'm 64 years old now, and I've learned that family isn't always blood, and blood isn't always family. But back then, 3 years ago, I still believed in the fairy tale that your children would never truly hurt you. God, was I wrong? My name is Robert Mitchell, and I spent 42 years building Mitchell Construction from nothing. Started with a beat-up truck and a toolbox my father left me, worked 18-hour days until my hands were permanently stained with concrete dust and my back bent like a question mark. But I built something, a company worth $12 million, 300 employees, contracts across 6 states. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, but more than that, I was proud that I was building a legacy for my daughter Sarah. Sarah was my world after her mother died when she was 16. Breast cancer took Rebecca in 8 brutal months, and suddenly it was just me and this angry, grieving teenager who blamed me for not being able to save the woman we both loved. I threw myself into work and threw money at Sarah's problems: private schools, college tuition, a brand new BMW for her 18th birthday, a down payment on her first house. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was showing love the only way I knew how. But grief does strange things to people. Sarah grew up resenting my absences, even though those absences paid for everything she wanted. She married Thomas Brennan when she was 26, a smooth-talking investment advisor who wore expensive suits and smiled with too many teeth. I never trusted him, but Sarah was happy, and after Rebecca's death, Sarah's happiness became my North Star. The first real crack in our foundation came during my 60th birthday dinner. I'd announced that I was planning to retire in 5 years and that Sarah would inherit the company. The room went quiet, and Thomas leaned back in his chair with this look, like he just won the lottery. Sarah didn't even smile. She just asked, "What about selling it?" I remember the confusion that washed over me. "Why would we sell it? This is our family business." Thomas jumped in before Sarah could answer. "Robert, with respect, Sarah's not a construction worker. She has a master's degree in marketing. Maybe it's time to think about liquidating assets and investing in something more appropriate for her skill set." The word appropriate hit me like a slap. This business wasn't just money, it was my life's work, my father's memory, my contribution to the world. Every building we'd constructed, every bridge we'd reinforced, every foundation we'd poured was a piece of my soul. And this kid in his fancy suit wanted to turn it into stock options. But what hurt more was Sarah's silence. She sat there, avoiding my eyes, while her husband dismantled everything I'd worked for with corporate buzzwords and investment jargon. That night, I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd lost my daughter to a man who saw dollar signs where I saw legacy. The arguments started then. Not screaming matches. We were too polite for that, but cold, calculated conversations about maximizing value and diversifying portfolios. Thomas would come to Sunday dinners armed with spreadsheets showing how much money Sarah could make if she sold the company and invested in tech stocks. Sarah would nod along, asking pointed questions about profit margins and exit strategies. I felt like I was watching my life's work being picked apart by vultures. But these vultures were my own family. Every conversation became a negotiation. Every visit became a sales pitch. And slowly, I started to understand that Sarah didn't want to build on what I'd created, she wanted to tear it down and sell the pieces. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. I'd had a minor heart attack, nothing serious, the doctors said, but a warning. Sarah came to the hospital, and instead of asking how I felt, she asked if I'd updated my will. Standing there in my hospital gown, connected to monitors that beeped with each heartbeat, I realized that my daughter was already planning my funeral. "Dad, we need to talk about succession planning," she said, pulling out a folder. Thomas has been working with some financial advisors, and we think. I'm not dead yet, I interrupted, and for the first time in years, there was steel in my voice. She had the decency to look embarrassed, but she didn't put the folder away. I know, Dad. But you scared us. And if something happens to you, we need to be prepared. Prepared. As if my death was just another business transaction that needed proper documentation. I signed myself out of the hospital that afternoon and drove home alone, with the bitter understanding that my daughter was counting down the days until my funeral. That's when I decided to test them. Call it a final attempt at reconciliation, or maybe I just needed to know for certain where I stood. I told Sarah and Thomas that I wanted to take a family vacation, just the three of us, somewhere beautiful where we could reconnect. Their faces lit up like Christmas morning, probably thinking a relaxed father might be more willing to sign papers. Sarah suggested Canada. Banff National Park, she said, showing me pictures on her phone. It's gorgeous this time of year, and Thomas has always wanted to see the mountains. I should have known something was wrong when Thomas immediately started researching flights and accommodations, taking control of every detail. But I was desperate to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to being a family. So I agreed to let them handle everything. 3 weeks later, we were boarding a plane to Calgary, and I was telling myself that this trip would change everything. I had no idea how right I was. The mountains were beautiful, snow-capped peaks that stretched to the horizon, lakes so blue they looked like paint. We stayed in a luxury cabin that Thomas had booked, complete with a hot tub and a view that belonged on a postcard. For the first 2 days, it actually felt like we were a family again. We went hiking, shared meals, talked about everything except business and inheritance and money. But on the third morning, something shifted. Sarah and Thomas were whispering in the kitchen when I came down for coffee, and they stopped talking when they saw me. Throughout breakfast, they kept exchanging glances, like they were communicating in some secret language I couldn't understand. Dad, Sarah finally said, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate care. We need to talk. And just like that, the vacation became something else entirely. The conversation that changed everything started with Sarah fidgeting with her wedding ring, a tell she'd had since childhood whenever she was about to say something she knew would hurt me. I should have recognized the warning sign, should have prepared myself for what was coming. But I was still clinging to the hope that this trip might save our relationship. What's on your mind, sweetheart? I asked, settling back in my chair with my coffee. The morning sun was streaming through the cabin windows, painting everything golden, and for a moment I thought maybe we could finally have an honest conversation about our family. Sarah looked at Thomas, who gave her an encouraging nod. That should have been my second warning. When your daughter needs her husband's permission to talk to her father, you know you've already lost her. Dad, we've been talking, and we think it's time you seriously considered retirement. Full retirement. The words hit me like cold water. We discussed this already. I said 5 years. 5 years is too long. Thomas interrupted, leaning forward with that predatory smile I'd grown to hate. Robert, you're 64 years old. You had a heart attack 3 weeks ago. Your doctor told you to reduce stress, didn't he? I felt my jaw clench. My doctor told me to take it easy, not to abandon everything I've built. You're not abandoning anything, Sarah said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use with difficult children. You're being smart. You're securing your future, and ours. There it was. The truth wrapped in concern for my well-being. This wasn't about my health or my happiness. This was about securing their inheritance while I was still alive to sign the papers. I set my coffee cup down carefully, buying time to choose my words. And what exactly are you proposing? Thomas pulled out his phone and opened a document. Of course he'd prepared a presentation. We've had the company appraised by 3 independent firms. Conservative estimate is $14.2 million. After taxes and fees, you'd walk away with roughly $10 million. Invested properly, that's enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. And what happens to the company? What happens to my employees? Sarah and Thomas exchanged another look. The buyer is interested in the contracts and the equipment, Sarah said. Some of the staff might be retained, but honestly, Dad, that's not our responsibility. We can't make business decisions based on sentiment. Sentiment. That's what she called 42 years of my life. The men and women who'd work beside me, who'd helped me build something meaningful, they were just sentiment to be discarded for a better profit margin. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains while my blood pressure climbed toward dangerous territory. Behind me, I could hear Thomas explaining tax advantages and investment strategies, his voice full of the kind of confidence that comes from never having built anything with your own hands. What if I say no? I asked without turning around. The silence stretched long enough that I finally faced them. Sarah was staring at her hands, and Thomas was checking his phone like this conversation bored him. Dad, Sarah finally said, you can't run the company forever. And if something happens to you, if you have another heart attack or, worse, the company will be sold anyway. But it'll be sold in a panic, probably for less money, and you won't be there to benefit from it. So this is really about protecting me? Yes, she said, but she couldn't meet my eyes. I sat back down and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. When had she become this stranger who spoke in corporate euphemisms and measured love in dollars? When had she stopped being the little girl who used to ride on my shoulders at construction sites, who used to be so proud to tell people her daddy built buildings? I need time to think about this, I said. Thomas's smile tightened. Of course. But Robert, I have to tell you, the buyer is only available for another 2 weeks. After that, who knows when we'll get another offer this good? Another manipulation, another pressure tactic. I'd been in construction long enough to recognize a hard sell when I heard one. They'd probably already agreed to the sale and were just waiting for my signature. The rest of that day felt like walking through fog. We went through the motions of family activities, a scenic drive, lunch at a local restaurant, more hiking, but everything felt forced and hollow. Sarah kept trying to make conversation about memories and family history, as if she could guilt me into signing away my life's work by reminding me of better times. That night, I lay in bed listening to them whispering in the next room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear: frustration, impatience, the kind of urgent planning that happens when things aren't going according to script. The next morning brought another family meeting. This time, they'd prepared documents. We thought you might want to look these over, Thomas said, sliding a folder across the table. Just preliminary agreements. Nothing binding. But it would help everyone if we could get a sense of your intentions. I opened the folder and felt my heart stop. Purchase agreements, transfer documents, dissolution papers, everything needed to sell Mitchell Construction, all pre-filled with my information. At the bottom of each page was a yellow sticky note with an arrow pointing to signature lines. You've already decided, I said. We've prepared for the possibility, Sarah corrected. Dad, this is a good thing. You could travel, spend time with grandchildren if I ever have any, enjoy your golden years without the stress of running a business. And what if I want to work until I die? What if the business gives my life meaning? Thomas laughed. Actually laughed. Robert, meaning doesn't pay for healthcare. Meaning doesn't guarantee your daughter's security. You're being emotional about something that should be purely financial. That's when I knew for certain that I'd lost Sarah completely. She sat there nodding while her husband dismissed 42 years of my life as emotional. The daughter I'd raised, the girl I'd worked myself to the bone to provide for, had become someone who saw her father's passion as a liability to be managed. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I'm not signing anything right now. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Sarah's face went tight, and Thomas's smile finally cracked. Dad, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I'm 64, not 94. I'm healthy except for one minor incident that the doctors say was mostly stress-related. Stress, I might add, that came largely from these conversations about selling everything I've built. Thomas leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, I saw calculation behind his eyes instead of false friendliness. What exactly do you want, Robert? The question hung in the air like smoke. What did I want? I wanted my daughter back. I wanted her to care about something other than money. I wanted to matter to my family for something more than the size of my bank account. But looking at their faces, I realized those things were already gone. I want to finish this vacation without any more business discussions, I said. I want to remember what it feels like to be a family instead of a board of directors. Sarah reached across the table and touched my hand. For a moment, her face softened, and I saw a flicker of the girl I'd raised. Okay, Dad. No more business talk. Let's just enjoy the rest of our time here. I should have known it was a lie. I should have seen the look that passed between her and Thomas. But I was desperate to believe that some part of my daughter still loved me for who I was, not what I was worth. So I spent the next 2 days pretending everything was normal, ignoring the whispered conversations and the long phone calls Thomas made while walking alone by the lake. I told myself we were healing, that maybe this trip would save us after all. I had no idea they were planning something that would destroy any chance of reconciliation forever. The morning they abandoned me started like any other day of our vacation. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Sarah moving around the kitchen, humming softly to herself. For a moment, lying there in bed, I let myself believe that maybe we'd turned a corner. Maybe the business discussions were behind us and we could salvage our relationship. I should have paid attention to the fact that Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, shuffling into the kitchen in my robe and slippers. "You're up early." Sarah turned with a smile that seemed different somehow, brighter, more animated than she'd been in months. "I thought we could drive into Banff today. There's a little antique shop I want to check out, and Thomas heard about a hiking trail that's supposed to have amazing views." "Where is Thomas?" "Loading the car. He wants to get an early start." She handed me a cup of coffee and kissed my cheek. "Go get dressed, Dad. It's going to be a beautiful day." The kiss felt like goodbye, but I pushed the thought away. Paranoia was just another symptom of stress, and the doctors had warned me about letting my imagination run wild. An hour later, we were driving through the Canadian Rockies in Thomas's rented SUV, with me in the passenger seat and Sarah behind us, taking pictures out the window. The conversation was light, observations about the scenery, plans for lunch, complaints about tourist traffic. Nothing about business or inheritance, or the future of Mitchell Construction. For the first time in weeks, I actually relaxed. "Turn here," Thomas said suddenly, pointing to a dirt road that branched off the main highway. "That's not the way to Banff," I said, checking the GPS on my phone. "Shortcut," Thomas replied. "Local guy at the gas station told me about it. More scenic, and it cuts 20 minutes off the drive." The dirt road wound through dense forest, climbing steadily into the mountains. My phone lost signal after about 10 minutes, and the road got rougher, more isolated. We hadn't seen another car since leaving the highway. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked from the back seat, her voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify. "Trust me," Thomas said, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and there was a muscle jumping in his jaw. After another 20 minutes, he pulled into a small clearing and stopped the engine. "Why are we stopping?" I asked. Thomas turned to face me, and his expression had changed completely. The friendly mask was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "We need to talk. I thought we agreed, no more business discussions." "This isn't about business anymore, Robert. This is about reality." Sarah leaned forward between the seats, and when I looked at her, I saw the same coldness in her eyes. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't a spontaneous stop. This was planned. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm, "you've had 3 days to think about our offer. We need an answer. And you brought me to the middle of nowhere to get one?" Thomas reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the same folder of documents from 2 days ago. "Sign them." "Or what?" That's when Sarah said the words that changed everything. "Or we leave you here." The silence in the car was deafening. Outside, Wind rustled through the trees and somewhere in the distance a bird called. But inside that SUV, the air felt thick enough to choke on. "You're joking," I said. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Sarah asked. Her voice was steady, businesslike, as if she were discussing the weather. "Dad, you're being stubborn about something that's inevitable. The company is going to be sold. The only question is whether you benefit from it or not. And if I don't sign?" Thomas shrugged. "Then you can think about it some more. Out here. Alone." I stared at my daughter, searching for any trace of the little girl I'd raised, the woman I'd loved and provided for and protected. But looking at her face, I saw only the cold calculation of a stranger. "You wouldn't actually leave me here, wouldn't we?" Thomas asked. He held up his phone. "No signal. No GPS. You don't know where we are or how to get back. There might be another car along this road today, or there might not. Are you willing to find out?" My hands started shaking, not from fear but from rage. "You planned this." "We planned for different contingencies," Sarah said. "We hoped it wouldn't come to this, but you're not giving us any choice." "I'm not giving you any choice? You're threatening to abandon your father in the wilderness because I won't sign away my life's work." "We're offering you a solution to a problem," Thomas said. "Sign the papers, and we all drive back to civilization together. Refuse, and you can spend some time out here thinking about what's really important." I looked back and forth between them, these two people who had become strangers wearing the faces of my family. "How long have you been planning this?" Sarah had the grace to look uncomfortable for the first time. "Dad, we just want what's best for everyone." "How long?" "Since the heart attack," Thomas said. "We realized we couldn't wait for you to be reasonable. Sometimes you have to force people to accept help." Help. They called extortion help. They called threatening to leave me stranded in a foreign wilderness help. And the worst part was that Sarah was nodding along, as if this made perfect sense. I reached for the door handle. "I'd rather walk than give in to blackmail." Thomas grabbed my wrist. "Robert, don't be stupid. You're 64 years old with a bad heart. It's 40 miles to the nearest town through mountain forest. Sign the papers. Go to hell." That's when Sarah leaned close to my ear and said the words that cut deepest. "Mom would be ashamed of how selfish you're being. She would want you to take care of your family instead of clinging to some buildings and equipment." Using Rebecca's memory as a weapon, that was the moment I knew my daughter was truly lost to me. The moment I understood that everything I thought I knew about love and family and loyalty had been an illusion. I yanked my arm free from Thomas's grip and opened the door. "You want me to get out?" "Fine. I'll get out." "Dad, wait." Sarah started, but I was already standing beside the car. "You think I built a $12 million company by folding the first time someone threatened me?" I slammed the door and stared at them through the windshield. "You think I survived 42 years in construction by letting people bully me into making bad decisions?" Thomas rolled down his window. "Last chance, Robert. Get back in the car and sign the papers, or we're leaving." I stepped back from the vehicle and crossed my arms. "Then leave." For a moment, I thought Sarah might break. She was staring at me through the back window, and I could see tears in her eyes. But then Thomas said something to her, and she wiped her face and looked away. Thomas revved the engine. "Have it your way, Robert. When you're ready to be reasonable, you know where to find us." The SUV lurched forward, tires spinning in the dirt. As they drove away, I heard Sarah's voice through the open window. "Get out, let's see how right you feel when you have no way to get home." They were both laughing. I stood in that clearing, watching the dust settle behind their disappearing car, and felt something inside me break. Not my heart, that had been cracking for months. Something deeper. Some fundamental belief about human nature and family bonds and the people we choose to love. They had actually done it. My only daughter and her husband had driven me into the wilderness and abandoned me because I wouldn't sign over my life's work. They were laughing as they left me to figure out how to survive alone in a foreign country with no phone signal, no transportation, and no clear way home. That's when the rage really hit me. Not the hot, explosive anger that makes you do stupid things, but the cold, calculating fury that makes you dangerous. Standing in that clearing, listening to the sound of their engine fade into nothing, I made a promise to myself. If I survived this, if I found a way home, I would make sure they regretted every second of this day for the rest of their lives. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that abandoning Robert Mitchell in the Canadian wilderness wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of mine. The first hour alone in that clearing, I won't lie to you, I panicked. The silence was overwhelming, no traffic, no voices, just wind through the trees and the occasional crack of branches settling. I walked to where the dirt road disappeared around a bend, hoping maybe they'd come back, maybe Sarah had convinced Thomas this had gone too far. But the road stayed empty. That's when survival instincts I didn't know I had kicked in. 42 years in construction teaches you to solve problems methodically, to assess what resources you have and figure out how to use them. So I took inventory. I had the clothes on my back, jeans, hiking boots, a fleece jacket, and a baseball cap. In my pockets, my wallet with about 200 Canadian dollars, a dead cell phone, reading glasses, and half a pack of the mints Sarah had bought me at the last gas station. The irony wasn't lost on me that my daughter's small kindness might be the only thing keeping my mouth from tasting like fear. The clearing was about the size of a basketball court, surrounded by dense forest with mountains visible through gaps in the trees. A small stream ran along one edge, which meant fresh water. The dirt road we'd come in on was my only connection to civilization, but I had no idea how far it was to the main highway or which direction led to help. I'm not outdoorsman. I've spent my entire adult life in cities and suburbs, building things and managing people. My idea of roughing it was a hotel without room service. But I've also spent decades solving problems under pressure, and panic never built anything useful. So I got to work. First priority was shelter. The October air had a bite to it, and I knew mountain temperatures could drop fast after sunset. I gathered fallen branches and pine boughs, using my belt and shoelaces to lash together a lean-to against a large boulder near the stream. It wasn't pretty, but it would block wind and trap some body heat. Next was signaling. I collected rocks and arranged them in a large arrow pointing toward the road, with help, spelled out in letters 6 feet tall. If anyone flew over, search planes, helicopters, they'd see it. I also gathered dry wood and kindling for a fire, though I'd saved the matches in my wallet until I really needed them. But as the day wore on and no other vehicles appeared on that dirt road, I started to understand that Thomas had chosen this route carefully. This wasn't just a random back road, this was genuinely isolated wilderness. They'd planned this down to the details, probably researched remote locations where they could abandon me with minimal risk of discovery. The cold calculation of it hit me harder than the actual abandonment. Sarah had sat in that back seat, watching her husband plan to strand her father in the wilderness, and said nothing. Worse than nothing, she'd participated. The woman I'd raised, whose college tuition I'd paid, whose wedding I'd financed, whose house I'd helped her buy, had looked me in the eye and threatened to leave me to die. But you know what? As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, as I huddled in my improvised shelter listening to sounds I couldn't identify, I realized something important. I wasn't ready to die. Not for them, not for anyone. Robert Mitchell had built something from nothing once before, and I'd do it again. That first night was the longest of my life. Every sound made me tense. Was that footsteps? A bear? Searchers? But morning came, gray and cold, and I was still alive. I drank from the stream, ate some pine nuts I'd identified as edible, and started walking. The road led downhill, which seemed like a good sign. Water flows toward civilization, and roads usually follow water. I walked for 3 hours, marking my path by breaking branches so I could find my way back to my shelter if needed. The silence was profound, no traffic sounds, no aircraft, just my footsteps on dirt and gravel. Then I heard an engine. I ran toward the sound, heart pounding, and saw a pickup truck coming up the road. I waved my arms and shouted, and the driver stopped, a local man named Jim who worked for the Forestry Service. He spoke with a thick Canadian accent and looked at me like I was a ghost. "Jesus, what are you doing out here?" he asked. That's when I had to make a choice. I could tell him the truth, that my daughter and son-in-law had abandoned me here as part of an extortion scheme. But that would mean police reports and international incidents, and Sarah facing charges. Despite everything, I wasn't ready to send my daughter to prison. So I lied. "Car broke down yesterday," I said. "My companions went for help, but I got worried when they didn't come back. Thought I'd try to walk out." Jim shook his head. "This road doesn't go anywhere near the main highway. Your friends got lost, guaranteed. Happens all the time with tourists. Hop in, I'll take you to town." During the hour-long drive to Banff, I learned that the road where they'd abandoned me was a dead-end logging route that hadn't seen regular traffic in months. Jim mentioned that the nearest cell tower was 40 miles away and that the area had no GPS coverage. Thomas hadn't chosen that spot randomly. He'd done his homework. "You're lucky I was out there," Jim said. "I only check that road once a week, and not always the same day. You could have been waiting a long time." At the RCMP station in Banff, I reported myself as a lost tourist whose companions had gone for help and never returned. The officers were sympathetic and efficient. They tried calling the number for Thomas's rental car, but it went straight to voicemail. They checked with the hotel where we'd been staying, checked out that morning, no forwarding address. "We'll file a report and keep looking," the constable assured me. "But honestly, sir, it sounds like your companions made it to safety and assumed you'd find your own way out. Happens more often than you'd think." I nodded and played the part of the confused elderly tourist, but inside I was burning with purpose. While the constable filled out paperwork, I was planning. See, here's what Sarah and Thomas didn't know about the man they'd abandoned in the wilderness. Robert Mitchell didn't get to where he was by giving up when things got tough. I'd built my company through economic recessions, worker strikes, supply shortages, and competitor sabotage. I'd lost my wife to cancer and raised a teenager while working 18-hour days. I'd survived a heart attack and climbed out of depression and kept moving forward when quitting would have been easier. And now they'd given me something I'd never had before, a legitimate reason to destroy them. The RCMP helped me contact the American consulate and arrange emergency travel documents. Within 48 hours, I was on a plane back to Seattle, officially a victim of an unfortunate misunderstanding with my family. The story I told was simple: communication breakdown, per cell service, everyone trying their best in a difficult situation. But during that flight home, staring out at clouds and mountains, I started planning something else entirely. Sarah and Thomas thought they could force me to sell my company by abandoning me in the wilderness. They thought they could break my will with fear and isolation and the threat of death. What they didn't understand was that they just handed me the motivation I needed to remind them who they were dealing with. Robert Mitchell didn't just build a construction company. I built a network. Contacts in banking, real estate, media, politics. People who owed me favors. People who respected what I'd accomplished. And I was about to use every single connection I'd made in 42 years to teach my daughter and her husband that some mistakes can't be undone. They thought abandoning me would make me desperate enough to sign their papers. Instead, they'd made me angry enough to destroy them. The plane touched down in Seattle, and I walked through customs with a clear conscience and a focused mind. Sarah and Thomas had played their hand, shown me exactly who they really were. Now it was my turn. And unlike them, when I played for keeps, I didn't leave anything to chance. The first thing I did when I got home wasn't call Sarah or Thomas. It wasn't report them to police or hire lawyers or do any of the obvious things a normal father might do after being abandoned by his own daughter. Instead, I walked into my study, opened my laptop, and started making a list. Names. Phone numbers. Favors owed and debts to collect. 42 years in the construction business had taught me that success isn't just about building things, it's about building relationships. And I was about to cash in every relationship I'd ever cultivated. First call was to Marcus Webb, an investigative journalist who'd covered the construction industry for the Seattle Times for 15 years. I'd given Marcus exclusive access to several major stories over the years: corruption in city permitting, safety violations by competitors, the occasional feel-good piece about Mitchell Construction's community involvement. Marcus owed me, and I was ready to collect. "Robert," Marcus said when he answered. "Heard you were in Canada. How was the family vacation?" "Educational," I said. "Marcus, I need a favor." "A big one." "What kind of favor?" "The kind that wins Pulitzer Prizes. How would you like to write about financial elder abuse in wealthy American families? Specifically, how children and their spouses systematically isolate and manipulate aging parents to gain control of family assets?" There was a pause. "That's very specific. You have a story in mind?" "I have documents, recorded conversations, and a case study that would make your career. But I need you to handle it carefully. This isn't about revenge, it's about exposing a pattern of behavior that affects thousands of families." The beauty of my approach was its simplicity. I wasn't going to destroy Sarah and Thomas through direct confrontation. That would have been messy, emotional, and ultimately unsatisfying. Instead, I was going to let them destroy themselves by exposing who they really were to the world. Second call was to Janet Holloway, my accountant for 20 years. Janet had helped me structure Mitchell Construction's finances, manage investments, and navigate complex tax situations. She knew every penny that flowed through my business and personal accounts. "Janet, I need you to prepare a comprehensive financial analysis. Every transaction, every payment, every gift I've made to Sarah and Thomas Brennan over the past 5 years. I want dates, amounts, and purposes. And Janet? I need it by tomorrow." "Robert, is everything okay? This sounds like divorce preparation." "Something like that. How much money have I given them total?" Janet was quiet for a moment, probably accessing files. "Ballpark? Including the house down payment, wedding expenses, car payments, credit card assistance, and various gifts, close to $400,000. $400,000. Almost $500,000 I'd given them out of love and generosity, while they were plotting to force me out of my own company. The irony was perfect. I'd funded their lifestyle while they planned my destruction. Third call was the most important. David Chin had been my lawyer for 18 years, handling everything from contract negotiations to liability issues. More importantly, David understood the construction business and had helped me navigate family succession planning when Rebecca was still alive. "David, I need to make some changes to my will and estate planning. Immediately." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that ensures certain people never benefit from my death." "How quickly can we set up a charitable foundation?" David was quiet for a long moment. "Robert, what happened in Canada?" I gave him the sanitized version: family disagreements about business succession, pressure to retire and sell the company, a breakdown in communication during our vacation. I didn't mention being abandoned in the wilderness. That was my ace in the hole, saved for the right moment. "I want to establish the Rebecca Mitchell Foundation," I continued. "Focus on supporting families affected by cancer, funding research, providing financial assistance for treatment." "And David?" "I want it funded with exactly the amount Sarah expects to inherit from selling Mitchell Construction." That's roughly $10 million, Robert." "Exactly. Every penny she thought she was entitled to will go to helping people who actually need it. She can read about her inheritance in the newspaper when I announce the foundation's launch." The fourth call was to Tommy Rizzuto, who ran the largest construction equipment rental company in the Pacific Northwest. Tommy and I had worked together for decades, sharing contracts and resources when projects demanded it. More importantly, Tommy's nephew worked for a major television network in Vancouver. "Tommy, remember that favor you said you owed me? The time I covered your payroll when that developer defaulted?" "Course I remember. What do you need?" "I need you to call your nephew. I have a story that needs to reach Canadian media outlets. Human interest piece about an American businessman who got lost in the wilderness and had to survive on his own." That doesn't sound like much of a story. It will be when they find out how I got lost. By the end of that first day back, I had set in motion a carefully orchestrated campaign that would systematically dismantle Sarah and Thomas's plans while exposing them for who they really were. But the most satisfying part was still to come, the moment when they realized that abandoning Robert Mitchell in the Canadian wilderness wasn't the end of their problems. It was the beginning of mine. The next morning, I called my office and told my assistant, Margaret, that I was taking a leave of absence for health reasons. Word would spread quickly, the boss having mysterious health issues right after a family vacation that ended badly. People would speculate, and speculation would eventually reach Sarah and Thomas. Then I drove to the bank and moved my personal assets into accounts they couldn't access. Not illegal, not vindictive, just prudent financial planning by a man who'd learned he couldn't trust his own family. I also changed the locks on my house and activated a security system. If they wanted to pressure me into signing documents, they'd have to do it legally, in public, with witnesses. But the real masterstroke came on day 3. Marcus Webb called with questions for his article. Robert, I've been researching financial elder abuse, and the patterns you described are fascinating. Children who view their parents as assets to be managed rather than people to be respected. But I need more specific examples. Can you provide documentation? Come to my house tonight. I'll show you everything. That evening, Marcus arrived with a camera crew, just him and a cameraman, nothing too obvious. I walked them through the months of pressure, the constant talk about selling the company, the documents Sarah and Thomas had prepared before I'd agreed to sign anything. I showed Marcus the purchase agreements they'd brought to Canada, complete with sticky notes marking signature lines. They prepared all this before asking for your consent? Marcus asked. They prepared it before we left for vacation. The whole trip was designed to get me somewhere isolated where they could pressure me to sign. Marcus leaned forward. And what happened when you refused? That's when I told him about the wilderness. About being driven to a dead-end logging road with no cell service. About the ultimatum, sign the papers or be abandoned 40 miles from civilization. About watching my daughter and her husband drive away, laughing, while I stood alone in the Canadian forest. The cameraman kept filming, and I could see Marcus calculating how big this story could become. This wasn't just financial elder abuse. This was attempted murder by abandonment. This was a daughter and her husband literally leaving her father to die in the wilderness because he wouldn't sign over his life's work. Do you have proof of this? Marcus asked. I smiled and pulled out my phone. I recorded part of their conversation in the car. Audio only, but you can hear them discussing the plan. What I didn't tell Marcus was that I'd been recording our business conversations for weeks, ever since I suspected they were manipulating me. The audio from the wilderness was just the most dramatic example. I had hours of Thomas discussing how to manage, me and Sarah agreeing to increasingly aggressive tactics. Robert, this is huge. National news huge. Are you prepared for what happens when this story breaks? I thought about my daughter laughing as they drove away. I thought about Rebecca, who'd raised Sarah to be better than this. I thought about 42 years of building something meaningful, only to have my own family try to tear it down for money. I'm prepared, I said. The interview took 3 hours. Marcus asked tough questions, demanded evidence, challenged my version of events. But I had documentation for everything: text messages, emails, financial records, even security camera footage of Thomas preparing documents in my kitchen while I was in the hospital after my heart attack. By the time Marcus left, I knew the story would run. More importantly, I knew it would run big. Wealthy American businessman abandoned in Canadian wilderness by greedy daughter and son-in-law. The optics alone would destroy them, but the evidence would finish the job. That night, I sat in my study with a glass of Rebecca's favorite wine, a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. Seemed appropriate, since I was about to honor her memory in the most meaningful way possible. The phone rang around 11 p.m. Sarah. Dad? We just got back to Seattle. Are you okay? We tried to find you after we got help, but the police said you'd already made it out safely. Her voice sounded concerned, maybe even scared. Good. They'd spent 3 days in luxury hotels, probably celebrating their successful intimidation, only to return home and find out I'd survived and made it home ahead of them. I'm fine, Sarah. Better than fine, actually. Dad, about what happened in Canada, things got emotional, and maybe we said some things. You didn't say anything, sweetheart. You did something. There's a difference. Long pause. What do you mean? I mean you chose Thomas over me. You chose money over family. And now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. Dad, you're being dramatic. We can work this out. We can still find a solution that works for everyone. I almost laughed. Even now, even after abandoning me in the wilderness, she thought this was a negotiation. She thought she could manipulate me into forgetting what they'd done. There is no we anymore, Sarah. You made that clear when you drove away and left me to die. We didn't leave you to die. We went for help. Then why did you check out of the hotel that morning? Why didn't you contact the police until 3 days later? Why were you laughing when you drove away? Silence. Finally, Thomas's voice in the background. Hang up. Don't say anything else. Dad, Sarah said, I think we should all take some time to cool down, and then we can discuss this rationally. Take all the time you want, sweetheart. But Sarah? Turn on the news tomorrow night. I think you'll find it interesting. I hung up and finished Rebecca's wine, watching the city lights through my study window. Somewhere out there, my daughter and her husband were realizing that Robert Mitchell wasn't the broken old man they tried to leave in the wilderness. Tomorrow, the whole world would know what kind of people they really were. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, my phone was ringing every 30 seconds. Marcus had done his job better than I'd hoped. The Seattle Times ran it as the lead story. Local businessman claims daughter abandoned him in Canadian wilderness over inheritance dispute. But that was just the beginning. By 2 p.m., CNN had picked it up. By 4 p.m., it was trending on social media. By evening, news vans were parked outside my house, and reporters were calling it one of the most shocking cases of family betrayal in recent memory. The audio recordings I'd provided were devastating. You could hear Sarah's voice clearly. Get out, let's see how right you feel when you have no way to get home. And then the laughter, both of them laughing as they drove away from a 64-year-old man in the middle of nowhere. But what really made the story explode wasn't just the abandonment. It was the context Marcus had built around it. The months of pressure, the prepared documents, the systematic isolation of an aging parent by adult children who saw him as nothing more than an ATM machine. This wasn't just about one family. This was about a growing epidemic of elder abuse disguised as family planning. I didn't answer the phone calls or respond to interview requests that first day. Let the story build momentum on its own. Let people digest the basic facts before I added any commentary. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your enemies destroy themselves with their own actions. Sarah called 17 times. Thomas called 12. I let them all go to voicemail and listened to their messages later, with something approaching entertainment. The first few were damage control. Dad, this is getting out of hand. We need to talk about managing this situation. Translation: they needed to figure out how to spin attempted murder by abandonment into a family misunderstanding. The middle messages were panic. Dad, please, we can fix this. The reporters are calling us. They're calling our neighbors. Please pick up the phone. Translation: they were discovering that actions have consequences. The last messages were anger. Dad, you're destroying our lives over a misunderstanding. This is cruel and unfair, and you know it. Translation: they still didn't understand that what they'd done was unforgivable. But the message that broke my heart came from Sarah at 3 a.m. on Wednesday. Dad, please. I'm your daughter. I made a mistake, but I'm still your little girl. Don't you love me anymore? That one I had to listen to 3 times before I could process it. She was trying to use our history, our relationship, the memory of who she used to be, to guilt me into protecting her from the consequences of who she'd become. The little girl who used to ride on my shoulders at construction sites was gone. The teenager I'd raised after her mother died was gone. The woman who'd laughed while abandoning me in the wilderness, that's who Sarah was now. And I couldn't love a memory hard enough to excuse the reality. Wednesday morning brought a knock on my door. Not reporters, I'd been avoiding them, but 2 detectives from the King County Sheriff's Office. Mr. Mitchell? We're investigating reports of a possible crime that occurred in Canada. Can we ask you a few questions? I invited them in and told them everything. The threats, the coercion, the abandonment, the evidence I had. They took notes and recorded our conversation with my permission. Mr. Mitchell, what you're describing could constitute kidnapping, extortion, and reckless endangerment. These are serious felony charges. I understand. Are you planning to press charges against your daughter and son-in-law? That was the question I'd been wrestling with for days. Seeing Sarah and Thomas prosecuted would destroy them completely, not just their reputations, but their freedom. Thomas could lose his financial advisor license. Sarah could face years in prison. They'd be unemployable, unmarriageable, social pariahs. It would also be justice. I haven't decided, I told the detectives. But I want my options preserved. They nodded and left, but I knew word of their visit would reach Sarah and Thomas within hours. The media storm was one thing, that was public relations damage they might eventually recover from. But criminal charges? That was life-destroying, and they know it. Sure enough, my doorbell rang at 6 p.m. Through the peephole, I could see Sarah standing on my porch alone, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her since she was a child. For just a moment my resolve wavered. This was still my daughter, the girl I'd raised, the woman I'd loved unconditionally for 34 years. I opened the door. Dad? She looked like she'd been crying for hours. Can I come in? Please? I stepped aside, and she walked into the living room where we'd shared so many family moments, Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, the evening I'd told her about her mother's diagnosis. Now it felt like a courtroom. Where's Thomas? I asked. He's staying at his brother's house. The reporters were camped outside our place, and his job put him on administrative leave pending investigation. She sat on the couch where she used to curl up with Rebecca for movie nights, and I took the chair across from her, the same chair where I'd sat when she was 16 and we'd had our first real conversation about her mother's death. Dad, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. What we did was wrong. I was wrong. But please don't let this destroy everything we've ever meant to each other. What did we ever mean to each other, Sarah? She looked shocked. You're my father. I'm your daughter. We're family. Family doesn't abandon family in the wilderness to extort them. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. We got desperate. Thomas said it would scare you into being reasonable, but we never intended to actually leave you there. Then why did you check out of the hotel that morning? Why didn't you report me missing? Why were you laughing when you drove away? She couldn't answer, and her silence was more damning than any excuse she might have offered. Sarah, do you know what I thought about during those hours in the forest? I thought about your mother. About how proud she was when you graduated college, how excited she was about your future. And I wondered what she would think of the woman you've become. The tears started then, and part of me wanted to comfort her. Part of me wanted to pull my little girl close and tell her everything would be okay, that we could fix this, that family forgives everything. But I kept seeing Thomas's calculated smile as he handed me those documents. I kept hearing Sarah's voice as she threatened to leave me stranded. I kept remembering the sound of their laughter as they drove away. Dad, I'll do anything to make this right. Tell me what you want. Tell me how to fix this. I want you to explain to me how the daughter I raised, the girl whose college I paid for, whose wedding I financed, whose house I helped buy, could look her father in the eye and threaten to leave him to die in the wilderness because he wouldn't sign over his life's work. She was crying harder now, the kind of sobbing that comes from deep shame and genuine regret. I don't know. I don't know how I became that person. Thomas said, he said you were being selfish, That you were keeping money from us that we needed, that we deserved. He made it sound like you were the one being unreasonable. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. It was easier than admitting I was being greedy. There it was. The truth, finally. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but she'd chosen to believe Thomas's justifications because they served her interests. She'd chosen money over morality, greed over love, and her husband over her father. Sarah, even if I forgive you, even if we somehow rebuild our relationship, how do I ever trust you again? How do I know you won't choose Thomas over me the next time it's convenient? Because I won't. Because I see now what I almost lost. Dad, please. Give me a chance to prove I'm still the daughter you raised. I looked at this woman sitting in my living room, 34 years old, successful, educated, everything I'd hoped she'd become, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd failed her. I'd given her everything she wanted but hadn't taught her everything she needed to know about character and loyalty, and the difference between right and wrong. Maybe that failure was mine. Maybe I was partly responsible for who she'd become. But that didn't change what she'd done, and it didn't erase the choice she'd made when it mattered most. Sarah, I love you. I will always love you. But I can't trust you. And without trust, what we have isn't really a family, it's just two people who share DNA and bad memories. She cried for another 10 minutes, and I sat there watching, feeling my heart break all over again. When she finally composed herself, she asked the question I'd been dreading. Are you going to press charges? I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd caused me more pain than any enemy ever had, and made a decision that surprised even me. That depends on you. Sarah stopped crying and looked up at me with something approaching hope in her eyes. What do you mean, it depends on me? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the news vans still parked on my street. 3 days of media coverage had turned my quiet neighborhood into a circus, but that was nothing compared to what criminal charges would bring. I mean, you have a choice to make, Sarah. You and Thomas both do. What kind of choice? I turned back to face her. You can spend the next 5 to 10 years in prison for kidnapping, extortion, and reckless endangerment. Thomas will lose his financial advisor license, you'll both have felony records, and you'll be unemployable for the rest of your lives. Or what? Or you can make things right. Not with me, that's impossible now. But with the world. I sat back down and pulled out a folder I'd prepared, knowing this conversation would eventually happen. These are the terms under which I'll consider not pressing charges. Sarah took the folder with shaking hands and opened it. I watched her face as she read, seeing shock give way to understanding and then to something that might have been relief. You want us to confess? Publicly? I want you to tell the truth. On camera, in detail, about what you did and why you did it. I want you to admit that you tried to extort your father by abandoning him in the wilderness. I want Thomas to explain how he researched isolated locations and planned the whole thing. Dad, that would destroy us. Sarah, you destroyed yourselves the moment you drove away and left me in that forest. I'm offering you a chance to take responsibility for what you did instead of spending the next decade in prison. She kept reading. You want us to repay every dollar you've given us over the past 5 years? $400,000, with interest. Consider it the cost of learning that family isn't a business transaction. And you want us to donate matching funds to the Rebecca Mitchell Foundation? Your mother believed in redemption through service to others. Maybe helping cancer patients will remind you what it means to think about someone other than yourselves. Sarah closed the folder and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And if we do all this, you won't press charges? If you do all this sincerely, completely, and without trying to minimize or excuse what you did, I'll consider it justice served. But Sarah, understand this clearly, we will never have a relationship again. You will never be welcome in this house. When I die, you will inherit nothing. The foundation will get everything. Dad, I'm not finished. You have 48 hours to decide. If you agree to these terms, the confessions need to be recorded and broadcast within 1 week. The money needs to be repaid within 30 days. If you refuse, or if you try to back out after agreeing, I'll pursue criminal charges to the full extent of the law. Sarah sat in silence for several minutes, and I could see her mind working through the options. Public humiliation and financial ruin versus prison time and complete destruction. It wasn't really a choice, it was damage control. What about Thomas? Does he know about this? That's between you and your husband. But Sarah, understand something. If either of you tries to spin this, minimize it, or present yourselves as victims, the deal is off. The world needs to see exactly who you are and what you're capable of. She nodded slowly. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you hate me? The question hit me like a physical blow. I looked at this woman, my daughter, the child I'd loved more than my own life, and tried to find the right words. I hate what you did. I hate who you became. I hate that my little girl turned into someone who could laugh while abandoning her father in the wilderness. But hate you? Sarah, if I could hate you, this would be so much easier. She started crying again, but quietly this time. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't take back those words or that laughter or the way I chose Thomas over you. But Dad, if there's any part of you that still loves me, please don't make me do this publicly. Please don't make me destroy what's left of my life. Your life, Sarah? What about mine? What about the fact that your actions could have killed me? What about the fact that you're only sorry because you got caught? I'm sorry because I hurt you. I'm sorry because I became someone Mom would be ashamed of. I'm sorry because I lost the best father any daughter could ask for, and I lost him because I got greedy and listened to a man who doesn't love me the way you do. Those words broke something inside me that I'd been trying to keep intact. The raw honesty, the genuine regret, the acknowledgement of what she'd lost. It was everything I'd been hoping to hear for months. But it was also 3 days too late. If you'd said that in the forest instead of laughing, if you'd said it instead of threatening me, if you'd said it any time before you got caught, maybe things would be different. But Sarah, remorse after consequences isn't the same as genuine repentance. She wiped her eyes and stood up. I need to talk to Thomas. You have 48 hours. After she left, I sat in that chair for a long time, staring at the spot where my daughter had been. The house felt emptier than it had since Rebecca died, but also cleaner somehow. Like a wound that had finally been properly drained. The next morning brought unexpected news. My assistant Margaret called with an update that changed everything. Robert, you need to turn on Channel 7. There's a development in your story. I switched on the television just in time to see Thomas Brennan standing in front of a cluster of microphones, looking like he'd slept in his car. The banner on the screen read, Son-in-law speaks out about wilderness abandonment allegations. I want to make it clear, Thomas was saying, that Mr. Mitchell's version of events in Canada is completely fabricated. Sarah and I did not abandon him anywhere. We had a disagreement about business matters, yes, but we would never endanger an elderly family member. My blood pressure spiked as I watched this man, this manipulative, calculating parasite, stand in front of cameras and call me a liar. He was trying to get ahead of the story, trying to control the narrative before Sarah could accept my terms. The truth is, Thomas continued, Robert Mitchell is suffering from age-related mental confusion exacerbated by his recent heart attack. Sarah and I have been trying to help him transition into retirement because we're concerned about his health and his ability to make sound decisions. What happened in Canada was a misunderstanding that he's turned into a conspiracy theory. Age-related mental confusion. He was trying to paint me as a delusional old man who'd imagined the whole thing. Classic manipulation tactic. Attack the credibility of your accuser while positioning yourself as the reasonable, concerned family member. The reporter asked. Mr. Brennan, we have audio recordings of what sounds like you and your wife laughing as you drove away from Mr. Mitchell. How do you explain that? Thomas smiled, the same predatory smile I'd learned to hate. Those recordings are taken out of context. We were laughing about something completely unrelated. Mr. Mitchell has edited them to support his false narrative. I turned off the television and called Marcus Webb immediately. Marcus, I need you to run the full audio recordings. Not edited clips, the complete conversations from start to finish. Let people hear the context Thomas is claiming exists. Robert, are you sure? The full recordings are over 2 hours long. They contain some pretty damaging personal conversations. Run them. All of them. I want the world to hear exactly what kind of man my daughter married. That afternoon, the Seattle Times released the complete audio files online. 2 hours and 37 minutes of conversations between Sarah, Thomas, and me, covering everything from their initial pressure tactics to the final moments before they abandoned me. The recordings were devastating. You could hear Thomas coaching Sarah on how to manipulate me. You could hear them discussing my weaknesses and how to exploit them. You could hear them planning the wilderness abandonment, choosing the location, discussing contingencies. But the most damaging part was a conversation I'd recorded while they thought I was sleeping in the hotel. Thomas. If he won't sign, we leave him out there overnight. One night in the wilderness will break him. Sarah. What if something happens to him? What if he gets hurt? Thomas. Then we inherit everything anyway, and we don't have to deal with his stubbornness anymore. Sarah. Thomas, that's horrible. Thomas. That's practical. Sarah, your father is old and sick. He's going to die soon anyway. We're just accelerating a process that's already inevitable. Sarah. I can't believe we're talking about this. Thomas. We're talking about securing our future. Your father built that company for you, not for strangers. If he won't give it to you willingly, then we take it. The media explosion that followed was nuclear. Thomas's press conference had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me look like a confused old man, he challenged people to examine the evidence more closely. And the evidence showed premeditated extortion with a callous disregard for human life. By evening, Thomas was trending on social media as one of the most hated men in America. Hashtag Thomas Brennan became synonymous with greed, elder abuse, and sociopathic behavior. Sarah, meanwhile, had gone into hiding. My phone rang at 11 p.m. Sarah calling from a number I didn't recognize. Dad, I'll do it. I'll accept your terms. All of them. What about Thomas? Thomas is done. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. I should have listened to you years ago about what kind of man he really was. And the public confession? I'll do it. I'll tell the world exactly what we did and why we did it. But Dad, after I do this, after I've paid the price you've set, is there any chance at all, that someday we might be able to? No, Sarah. There isn't. The silence stretched for almost a minute. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I love you, Dad. I know you do, sweetheart. That's why this hurts so much. She hung up, and I sat in my study until dawn, mourning the death of a relationship that had defined my life for 34 years. 3 days later, Sarah Brennan appeared on national television and told the world everything. The interview was scheduled for Thursday evening on CNN's primetime slot, but Sarah called me that morning with a request that surprised me. Dad, I want to do this right. I want to tell the complete truth, not just the parts that make me look slightly less terrible. But I need you to know something first. What's that? Thomas threatened me yesterday. He said if I went through with the confession, he'd claim I was mentally unstable and that everything was my idea. He said he'd destroy me in the divorce proceedings. I felt a familiar rage building in my chest. Even now, even after being exposed as the manipulative sociopath he was, Thomas was still trying to control the narrative by threatening my daughter. What did you tell him? I told him he already destroyed me. I told him the worst thing that ever happened to me wasn't being abandoned in Canada. It was abandoning you. Her voice cracked. Dad, I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that I finally see him for what he is, and I see myself for what I became. Sarah. Let me finish. Please. I spent 3 years listening to that man tell me that family was just another word for people who owed each other money. That love was a weakness to be exploited. That you were holding back what belonged to me. And I believed him because it was easier than admitting I was being selfish and ungrateful. She was crying now, but her voice remained steady. But in that forest, when we drove away and you just stood there. Dad, you looked so small. So alone. And I realized that I'd just abandoned the one person who never abandoned me. Not when Mom died. Not when I was angry and difficult and blamed you for everything. Not when I married Thomas against your advice. You never gave up on me, and I gave up on you for money. I couldn't speak. The combination of rage at Thomas and heartbreak over Sarah was overwhelming. I'm going to tell them everything tonight. Not just about Canada, but about all of it. How we pressured you, how we manipulated you, how we planned to force you out of your own company. And Dad? I'm going to tell them that you were right about Thomas from the very beginning. That evening, I watched from my study as my daughter sat across from Anderson Cooper and methodically destroyed what was left of her reputation. She was calm, composed, and unflinchingly honest about every detail of their plan. We researched isolated locations where we could take him, she said, looking directly into the camera. Thomas found that logging road specifically because it had no cell service and almost no traffic. We planned to abandon my father there until he agreed to sign over his company to us. Cooper asked, Ms. Brennan, did you consider what might happen to your father if he couldn't find help? We considered it. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact. Thomas said that if something happened to my father, we'd inherit everything anyway. He said we were accelerating a natural process. And how did you respond to that? Sarah looked down at her hands. I should have walked away. I should have protected my father from the man I married. Instead, I convinced myself that we were doing what was best for everyone. I told myself that my father was being stubborn and unreasonable, and that we had a right to his money. You have audio recordings of your husband discussing this plan? Yes. Hours of recordings. Thomas coached me on how to manipulate my father emotionally. He researched my father's psychological vulnerabilities after his heart attack. He turned our family discussions into strategic planning sessions for financial extortion. Cooper leaned forward. This is your husband we're talking about. The man you married, presumably because you loved him. I thought I loved him. But Thomas doesn't love anyone. He collects people who are useful to him. I was useful because I gave him access to my father's money. My father was useful until he refused to be controlled. When people stop being useful to Thomas, he discards them. What made you realize this? When I heard him telling reporters that my father was suffering from mental confusion. When I heard him claiming that a 64-year-old man who built a $12 million company from nothing was too incompetent to make his own decisions. That's when I understood that Thomas would say anything, hurt anyone, destroy any relationship to get what he wanted. The interview lasted 45 minutes, and Sarah answered every question with brutal honesty. She admitted to laughing as they drove away. She admitted to checking out of the hotel before reporting me missing. She admitted that the entire vacation had been planned as a setup to get me somewhere isolated where they could pressure me. But the moment that broke my heart came near the end, when Cooper asked, "Do you think your father will ever forgive you?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up, her eyes were red but her voice was steady. No. And he shouldn't. What I did was unforgivable. I abandoned the man who never abandoned me, and I did it for money. My father spent 42 years building something meaningful, and I tried to tear it down in a single conversation because my husband convinced me I was entitled to it. What would you say to your father if he's watching right now? I would say that I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover what I owe him. I would say that he was right about Thomas from the very beginning, and I should have listened. I would say that every dollar he spent on me, every sacrifice he made, every time he put my needs before his own, I threw it all away because I got greedy and forgot what real love looks like. She took a shaky breath. And I would say that I'm proud to be Robert Mitchell's daughter, even though he's not proud to have me as his daughter anymore. He built something that mattered. He employed hundreds of people and created things that will last long after we're all gone. And I almost destroyed it for stock options. Cooper asked one final question. What happens now? Now I pay the price for what I did. I'm divorcing Thomas. I'm repaying my father every dollar he gave us, and I'm donating matching funds to a cancer research foundation in my mother's name. It won't make up for what I did, but maybe it will help other people in a way that honors the parents who raised me to be better than I became." The interview ended, and I sat in my study for a long time, staring at the black screen. Sarah had kept her word. She told the complete truth, accepted full responsibility, and made no excuses for her actions. She'd thrown herself on the mercy of public opinion and asked for nothing in return. But what surprised me was that I felt no satisfaction. No sense of justice served or revenge completed. Just emptiness where my daughter used to be. The next morning brought news that Thomas had been arrested on federal charges. The FBI had been investigating him for financial fraud involving other elderly clients, and Sarah's confession had provided the final evidence they needed. He would spend the next decade in prison, his license permanently revoked, his life destroyed. Sarah, meanwhile, had disappeared from public view. The media tried to find her for follow-up interviews, but she'd gone completely off the radar. Her divorce was finalized within 2 months, and according to my lawyer, she'd signed away any claim to Thomas's assets in exchange for him not contesting the proceedings. 3 weeks after the interview, I received a cashier's check for $407,000, the full amount I'd given them over 5 years, plus interest calculated to the penny. The memo line read, "Payment of debt owed with gratitude for lessons learned too late." A week later, the Rebecca Mitchell Foundation received an anonymous donation for the same amount. The donor information was sealed, but I knew it was Sarah. She'd kept her word completely, even though doing so probably left her with nothing. 2 years have passed since that interview, and I need to tell you something that might surprise you after everything you've heard. I was wrong about a lot of things. Not about Sarah and Thomas. They did exactly what I said they did, and the evidence speaks for itself. But I was wrong about what justice looks like, and I was wrong about what revenge costs the person who seeks it. The media storm died down eventually, as media storms always do. Thomas is serving 8 years in federal prison for elder abuse and financial fraud involving multiple victims. Sarah's confession helped convict him, and the prosecutor told me that without her testimony, he might have gotten away with much lighter charges. But here's the thing about revenge. It's like chemotherapy. It kills the disease, but it damages everything around it too. I got justice, I protected other potential victims, I made sure the world knew who Thomas really was. But in the process, I lost something I can never get back, the possibility of redemption for my daughter. 6 months after the interview, I started getting letters. Not from reporters or lawyers or curiosity seekers, but from families dealing with similar situations. Adult children trying to manipulate aging parents. Elderly people being pressured to sign over assets. People who recognized their own stories in mine. One letter particularly stuck with me. It was from a woman in Ohio whose son and daughter-in-law had been using similar tactics: emotional manipulation, financial pressure, threats of abandonment. She wrote, "Your daughter's confession saved my family. When I showed my son the interview, he broke down and admitted what they'd been planning. We're getting counseling now, trying to rebuild trust. Thank you for having the courage to expose this pattern of abuse." That letter made me realize something I hadn't considered during my campaign for justice. Sarah's public confession wasn't just punishment, it was prevention. By telling her story honestly and completely, she'd help other families recognize the warning signs and get help before it was too late. But it also made me realize that I'd been so focused on making Sarah pay for her choices that I'd never given her a chance to truly make things right. Last month, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photo album I'd never seen before, pictures Sarah had apparently been collecting for years. Photos of construction sites I'd worked on, buildings Mitchell Construction had erected, bridges we'd reinforced. Each photo had a small note in Sarah's handwriting describing what the project meant to the community. The Henderson Elementary School Library Wing, built 1987. You always said this was your favorite project because it was about giving kids a place to dream. The Riverside Bridge renovation, completed 2003. You worked 18-hour days for 3 months because you said people's lives depended on getting it right. The St. Mary's Hospital expansion, finished 2010. Mom was so proud when you donated your fee back to the Children's Cancer Ward. Page after page of my life's work, documented by a daughter who'd been paying attention even when I thought she didn't care. At the end of the album was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. Dad, I know you said we'll never have a relationship again, and I understand why. But I needed you to know that I remember who you really are and what you've accomplished. I remember why Mom was proud to be married to you and why I was proud to be your daughter, even when I was too selfish to show it. I can't undo what I did in Canada. I can't take back the laughing or the threats or the 3 years of greed that led to that moment. But I can make sure that other people don't make the same mistakes I did. I'm working with elder abuse prevention programs now, sharing my story with families who are dealing with financial manipulation. I'm not trying to rehabilitate my reputation or make people forgive me. I'm trying to use the worst thing I ever did to prevent other people from doing the same thing. I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't expect you to. But I hope someday you'll be able to think of me as someone who learned from her mistakes instead of just someone who made them. I love you, Dad. I always have, even when I forgot how to show it. Sarah. P.S. The foundation has helped 847 families so far. Mom would be proud. I stared at that album for hours, remembering each project, each challenge overcome, each small way Mitchell Construction had made the world a little better. And I realized that Sarah had been watching, learning, understanding what mattered to me even when she seemed focused only on money. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I called her. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone for months. Dad? I got your album. Silence for a moment then. Did it help you remember? It helped me remember a lot of things. Including the fact that your mother always believed people could change if they really wanted to. Dad, I'm not calling to reconcile, Sarah. I'm not ready for that, and I may never be. But I'm calling to tell you that I see what you're trying to do with the elder abuse programs, and your mother would be proud. I could hear her crying softly. That means everything to me. I also want you to know that the foundation has been incredible. 847 families helped so far, just like you said. Rebecca would love knowing her name is attached to something that's making such a difference. I check the website every week. I read every story about families you've helped. It's the only way I get to feel connected to you and Mom anymore. Sarah, answer me honestly, do you understand why I can't forgive you? Yes, she said immediately. Because some things are unforgivable. Because trust, once broken completely, can't be rebuilt. Because I made a choice that revealed who I really was, and that person was someone you couldn't love. And do you understand why I had to expose you publicly? Because justice matters. Because other families needed to see the warning signs. Because the world needed to know that even people who seem loving and normal can be capable of terrible things when money is involved. For the first time in 2 years, I heard wisdom in my daughter's voice instead of manipulation or self-pity. Sarah, I want you to keep doing the work you're doing. I want you to keep using your story to help other families. And I want you to know that while I can't forgive you, I can respect the person you're trying to become. Dad, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When you die, will you at least not hate me? The question broke my heart all over again. Sweetheart, I've never hated you. I hate what you did. I can't trust who you were. But I've never hated you, and I never will. She was crying harder now. I miss you so much. I miss our Sunday dinners and our arguments about politics and the way you used to explain construction projects like they were the most important things in the world. They were important. Every building we put up, every foundation we poured, every bridge we reinforced, they all mattered because they were part of something bigger than profit margins. I understand that now. I understand why you couldn't just sell the company and retire. It wasn't about the money, it was about the legacy. It was about the work itself. About building things that last, things that serve people, things that make communities stronger. Dad? Yeah? I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it one more time. I'm sorry for forgetting who you taught me to be. I know you are, Sarah. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry too. Sorry for what? For not teaching you better how to recognize manipulation when you saw it. For not making sure you understood that family loyalty can't be purchased or threatened into existence. For not showing you that real love doesn't come with conditions or price tags. We talked for another hour, and when we hung up, something had shifted. Not reconciliation, that bridge had been burned beyond repair. But understanding, maybe. Acceptance of what we'd lost and what we'd learned from losing it. 3 years ago, my daughter and her husband abandoned me in the Canadian wilderness because I wouldn't sign over my life's work. They laughed as they drove away, thinking they'd broken my will and forced me to submit to their demands. What they actually did was teach me the difference between family and blood, between love and manipulation, between justice and revenge. They taught me that some betrayals are so complete they transform you into someone different, not necessarily better or worse, just different. But they also taught me something unexpected, that sometimes the worst thing someone does to you can become the catalyst for the best thing you do with the rest of your life. The Rebecca Mitchell Foundation has now helped over 1,000 families affected by cancer. Mitchell Construction continues to build things that matter, and I've trained a management team that will keep it running long after I'm gone, not for profit, but for purpose. And somewhere in this country, Sarah is using the worst mistake she ever made to prevent other families from making the same one. She can't undo what she did, and I can't forgive what she did, but she's making sure it means something. That's not the ending I wanted when this story began. It's not the happy reunion or the complete redemption that makes for a satisfying movie. But it's the truth, and sometimes the truth is more valuable than satisfaction. If you're dealing with family members who see you as an asset instead of a person, who pressure you with guilt and manipulation, who threaten you with abandonment unless you give them what they want, learn from my story. Set boundaries. Document everything. Don't let love blind you to manipulation. And if you're someone who's been manipulating family members for money, pressuring elderly parents or relatives, learn from Sarah's story. Understand that some actions have consequences that last forever. Understand that greed can cost you everything that actually matters. Family should be about love, not leverage. Inheritance should be about generosity, not entitlement. And trust, once broken completely, can never be fully repaired, but it can be transformed into wisdom if you're willing to do the work. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it helps you recognize the warning signs in your own life before it's too late. And if you're watching from somewhere dealing with family manipulation or elder abuse, know that you're not alone and that justice is possible, even when forgiveness isn't. Drop a comment about where you're watching from, and remember, family isn't always blood, and blood isn't always family. Choose the people who choose you, and never let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself from those who don't. Some bridges are meant to be burned. Sometimes the fire is the only thing that lights the way forward.